Thank you all. So I'm going to try to be a little bit different here because I run a different type of site. Okay, I'm not really a journalist. I was never a journalist. My dad was a journalist, but I don't consider myself a journalist even today, even though I occasionally break news. I've got a media property that is now viewed by millions of people each year, but it's kind of like a hobby that turned into this passion that became a business. But it all kind of came clear to me about 9 months ago. I was at a Christmas party in New York City, and a New York Times editor was introduced to me. In which I was introduced as someone who runs this website called Political Wire, and she instantly recoiled. For 25 years she'd been an editor at the New York Times, and she was absolutely, there was something wrong. And I hadn't said anything yet, so I know I didn't offend her. And I was very, very intrigued by this, and so she immediately asked me, so who reads your website? And I said, well, it's a lot of the same people who read the New York Times. And she's like, no. And she immediately takes great offense. And she says, she immediately launches into an attack on me, which was pretty interesting, which was, her line of attack was, who fact checks you? That was her, which is pretty ironic considering the fact that the New York Times had Judith Miller writing for them while she was making up stories about the Iraq War, or Jason Blair, who was just making up stories, period. But it was kind of interesting, and she explained to me the entire infrastructure that they had at the New York Times, which was teams of fact checkers and teams of people that were checking all of their work. And I said, well, that's interesting. And so she kept pressing. She said, who fact checks you? I said, well, that's an interesting question. I said, first of all, I don't really intend to put up anything that I don't believe to be true myself. So I guess I'm the first line of defense, in terms of putting up interesting things. I said, but what's interesting is that I can't really get away with putting up anything that's not right, because within 5 minutes of having something up there, I have commenters, I have emails, I have this rapid feedback that, whoa, I messed up. And you know something? Just yesterday I messed up. Just yesterday I put up a poll that was attributed to an organization that I'd never heard of, but it was an interesting poll, and it seemed in line with other things. And what was very ironic about it was the person who alerted me, once again within 5 minutes, was a guy named Nate Silver, who many of you probably know, who actually works at the New York Times now. And so, the New York Times is my fact checker. So, there's a lot of people who are fact checkers. But anyway, it's fairly interesting. It was an interesting way of looking at what I do, mainly because what I don't want to do tonight is I don't want to give a speech. I don't want to sit there and talk and bore you guys about what I think or make predictions, which I can't make because I don't think politics is all that predictable, really. But what I want to do is I want to really kind of set the stage for what is, no matter how you look at it, is going to be a historic election one way or another. It's either going to go the way many pundits think it's going to go right now, which is against the Democrats, or it's going to surprise everybody. And we've seen very strange things happen. But if you read Political Wire, a lot of this will be redundant, but I promise I'll be short. But I'm just going to kind of set the stage in terms of what we're seeing right now, and then I hope we can have a discussion about what you guys think, because really what Political Wire is an interactive process. 40% of the things that end up on Political Wire come from readers, just average people. People send me stuff, people tell me what's interesting, tell me what they're seeing in local races, and then, it becomes interesting. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put together what I think is the most important things in politics that day. And so that's what I try to put up. So anyway, I'm hoping that we can have like a much more interactive discussion than just me boring you with some, new theory or some, pontification. So anyway, what we see about a year ago, the first person that I saw predicting, saying that something was happening, that there was this wave forming, was Charlie Cook, who's an analyst for the Cook Political Report, and he also writes a column with National Journal. And he was the first one, which is very interesting, that he is also one of the old line political analysts who is not, he is not the Nate Silver, let's just say. Nate Silver, who uses polls and econometric models and all sorts of fancy forecasting techniques, and Charlie talks to people. And that's how he gets to a lot of his data. He looks at polls, but he uses more of the field. But he was the first person that I heard of that saw a wave forming. And so let's look at the evidence of this wave, okay? So a year later, let's look at it. We read about it every day. We know, as of yesterday, a Gallup poll came out, the generic congressional ballot, that shows Republicans are now holding a huge lead among likely voters in 2 scenarios. They've modeled 2 scenarios, one of which is a high turnout scenario in which Democrats do a little bit better, but still Republicans lead by 12 points, 53 to 41 in the generic ballot. In a lower turnout model, Republicans lead 56 to 39%, just a total blowout. Now put that in perspective, some of these models that people use, including a very renowned one at Emory University, suggest that if the GOP held in the Gallup generic model just a 3-point lead, they would have the 39 seats in the House like that. That's all they need is a 3-point lead in the generic battle. That's what their forecasts show. So you're looking at a monstrous lead here. We're looking at a monstrous wave, if this is correct, for Republicans. Nate Silver, his forecast, there's a 72% chance right now. This is running 1 million simulations, or maybe it's not, maybe 10,000, I can't remember the number, but he runs these constant simulations. There's a 72% chance for Republicans to take control of the House, 50% chance that they'll win 50 seats, okay? Once again, a huge turnover in terms of net seats. Something that 12 months ago nobody was predicting, okay? Nate also says that there was a 24% chance that Republicans take control of the Senate. Once again, 12 months ago, the Senate wasn't even being talked about. There was no way that that was going to happen. Charlie Cook, his latest forecast, says Republicans now have a better chance of winning more than 45 seats than they do of falling short of the 39 to take control. So there's a better than even chance, he says, that the Republicans win more than 45 House seats. If you're a Democrat, you're probably getting a little depressed right now. A Republican pollster, Glenn Bolger, looked at 66 Democratic House districts that were rated by Charlie Cook as toss-up or leaning Democrat, and found that in the generic battle, in those Democratic seats, districts in which the Democrat is the congressman or congresswoman in those seats, Republicans lead in the generic ballot question 49 to 31, okay, in 66 seats. Just a massive shift. Once again, let's go to the we're at a university, we'll go to the forecasting models. We go, Alan Abramowitz at Emory predicts 49 House seats. Now these were done a couple months ago, but nonetheless, their predictive power, at least by these professors, they believe that they can do this several months. They don't need the most recent data. He predicts 49 House seats for Republicans, net House seats. Joe Bafumi of Dartmouth, 50 House seats for Republicans. James Campbell of SUNY Buffalo, 50 to 52 House seats. Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia, 47 House seats for Republicans. So it's just a massive wave forming. On top of that, you've got 2 other bits of information. I won't point to all of these, but they're pretty interesting. One is the outside spending by outside groups that are not Republican or affiliated with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. All cycle, it looked as if Democrats would be overwhelmingly competitive given the disarray at the Republican National Committee. Michael Steele as chairman has been nothing short of a disaster for the party. They've tapped, I think, now a 13 or 14, maybe even higher, $1 million line of credit right now. And the Republican Governors Association has essentially stepped in to try to replace much of what the RNC does. It's been such a bad show at the RNC. Nonetheless, outside groups made possible by a Supreme Court ruling a year or so ago, Citizen United ruling, shows that these outside groups are spending 7 times more on Republican candidates than Democratic candidates. Tens of millions of dollars that are being spent on Republicans. Republicans can't keep up with this. I mean, Democrats can't keep up with this type of spending, even though they hold the House, they hold the Senate, and they hold the White House. They can't raise money fast enough in those more traditional areas, even though they've had a decent, fundraising run. The outside groups are more than making up the difference of the disarray at the Republican National Committee. One more statistic that I'll talk about, which is young voters. Okay, the young voters that fueled much of President Obama's success in 2008. An NBC Wall Street Journal poll finds that just 35% of 18 to 34-year-olds are enthusiastic about voting, while 65% of seniors are. It's just a massive shift in who's going to come out. and seniors are voting overwhelmingly for Republicans. Okay, now if you're a Democrat, you're totally depressed, and you're probably very unenthusiastic yourselves. But let's just say, but wait, nobody's voted yet. Okay, let's look at a couple other things here. Republicans, the first point, is Republicans are still very unpopular. According to a Bloomberg poll that came out just this morning, 49% of likely voters have an unfavorable view of the Republican Party. 49%. Just 45% have an unfavorable view of Democrats. Still bad, but when you look at that, it's not like if there is a wave forming and they're going to vote, and voters are going to vote for the Republican Party. They're not too pleased with the Republican Party either. A Newsweek poll found, this is about a week ago, found that Democrats are trusted more on nearly every issue. They had a 6-point lead on Afghanistan, 12-point lead on health care, 4-point lead on Social Security, 14-point lead on Wall Street reform, 19-point lead on energy, 19-point lead on education, 5-point lead on taxes, 4-point lead on the federal budget, and a 10-point lead on the economy. The only area in which Republicans did better than Democrats was on national security and terrorism, where they were ahead by 6 points. Okay? Okay, so that's a pretty interesting thing. We've got this wave forming, and there's all of a sudden the alternative to the Democrats who are in power is this very unpopular party. I mean, that's a very interesting fact. That is very unlike the 2 previous wave elections that we've had in 2008 and 2006. Change elections. One more thing that Democrats might want to look toward, which is an historic example, which is interesting being here at the Clinton School. Because in the fall of 1998, Democrats faced historic losses. Okay, if you put yourself back into 1998, in the middle of the impeachment and Republican overreach, all of a sudden, 2 weeks before the election, Democrats got their message right. And all of a sudden, they started rallying around their president. And they rallied, and they used this, it was this message of Republican overreach. And it was very interesting because in that year, despite the fact that these same forecasters were predicting a bloodbath of sorts, probably not as bad as today, but still a bloodbath for the Democrats, Democrats lost no Senate seats, they gained 5 House seats, and Newt Gingrich was forced out of office in a very short period of time. So that said, you don't really know about politics, right? We have no idea. Sometimes we can change things. Anyway, that's about all I'm going to say in terms of just setting a backdrop, but it's a pretty interesting election that we have coming. And I would love to talk with you guys. I'd love to hear what you think are the more interesting races. I'd love to, if you have some points. I'm a little obsessive about this since, as Mark said, I kind of refresh my site, hourly, if not more so, although I'm not doing it right now. So, but anyway, if you guys would like to talk about any of your favorite races, you want to talk about some of the things that I've seen, I'd be happy to chat about that.
All right, your chance. Conversation on politics right here.
Hi, I'm wondering if you find this possible Republican tide one that floats all boats, because there are some incredibly eccentric people running, like Christine O'Donnell, Palladino in New York, Ken Buck, Rand Paul. Is their boat going to be lifted with the more rational people's?
My wife said I should start this speech saying, I am not a witch. But it's amazing. In a country of 320 million people, we have some very interesting characters who are running for the highest offices in our land. I mean, Christine O'Donnell, she's interesting. You could spend a month trying to learn about her. She's so fascinating. We have a situation in Alaska with Joe Miller, the Republican nominee who beat Lisa Murkowski for the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. He's a guy who, as soon as people started getting into his background, which is interesting, he said yesterday he's no longer talking about his background. So in the middle of the campaign, he's now not going to talk about his background. That's an interesting thing. You have in Nevada, you have Sharon Engel, Republican nominee for U.S. Senate, running against Harry Reid. The Republican Party wanted nothing to do with her. She is, by all accounts, on the very far extreme edge of that party. She's the nominee. Not only is she the nominee, though, she raised $14 million last quarter. $14 million. That's extraordinary. That was the main difference between any Republican and Harry Reid. Harry Reid had $30 million. And that was the main difference. And she raised $14 million in one quarter. You have on the Democratic side, just to be bipartisan about this, you have in South Carolina, the U.S. Senate nominee was an unemployed veteran who lived with his parents, who didn't campaign, and is facing obscenity charges. I mean, this is for the highest office in our land. There's only 100 U.S. senators, and this is the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate. You have on the state level, you have up in New York, Carl Palladino, who sounds like he's out of The Sopranos. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, he's telling reporters he's going to take them out. They have a video of him today asking, what would you do with Eric Holder, the Attorney General, if the Attorney General wanted to have hold terrorism trials in New York City? And he basically told him to F off. You know, a video of this. I mean, it's extraordinary, some of the people that we have. But anyway, I think that if it's a little early to kind of analyze like what's happening here, I think, but it is very bizarre to have 3 consecutive change elections, okay? And that's what we're having. And it's not too far a stretch to look ahead 2 years to 2012 to suggest we'd have yet another one. You could see a situation where either the Republicans are voted into power this year and voted out 2 years from now, or you could have them throw Obama out too, depending upon other things. But you have voters, it seems, very concerned and very frustrated and a lot of anger. And the anger, whether it's short-term anger about the recession and the economic problems now, or it could be longer-term anger. It could be the fact that, I mean, this could be that same anger that we saw back during the Perot years in '92 and '96 that Ross Perot tapped and was able to ride, not successfully, but pretty interestingly, a third-party movement. You have a very interesting dynamic. You look ahead to the 2012 presidential election, you can easily see, despite whatever their successes are right now, you can easily see a divided Republican Party in those primaries. I mean, there were 3 factions of Republicans. You had the national security hawks, you had the Wall Street Republicans, the fiscal conservatives, and you had the Christian conservatives. Those 3 factions were kept together by Ronald Reagan, and George Bush blew it. You know, George Bush lost them. The only one he kept was the Christian conservative. The other 2 kind of faded away. They didn't trust him on the fiscal conservatism, and he didn't do very well managing a war in Iraq or Afghanistan, for that matter. So you've kind of got a situation now where those 3 factions are out there, and you're going to go into a primary season, and Republicans are going to fight it out. And you can see a situation where a Sarah Palin might have the Christian conservative vote, but she's not trusted by any of the other factions. And it's totally up in the air. You can see what happened. But you could also have one of these factions. Let's say it's the fiscal conservative faction. It looks at the Republican Party and says, John Boehner and his gang, what a joke. They didn't do it when they're in power. They haven't said anything fiscally responsible while they're running. And let's assume they get in power and then they still haven't been able to be successful there. You could see a situation like that. And then they look to the Democrats and they said, the Democrats aren't for us either. The Democrats have expanded government, expanded the role of government in a lot of ways, have not paid for it as well. And so you could see that faction leaving. And is that faction alone enough to start a third-party movement? Probably not. But maybe combined with some other faction in American politics, maybe the Democrats start splitting. You know, the Democrats have built a coalition, as we're seeing this year, in districts of running some very conservative candidates in some districts, which is how they gained majorities. And now you read this morning that out of 54 Blue Dog Democrats, the conservative Democrats, out of 54 Blue Dog House Democrats, half are expected to lose this year. You know, so you have that coalition is kind of breaking down for the Democrats as well. The coalition that Rahm Emanuel and Nancy Pelosi were able to put together to retake the House in 2006.
French?
You made an interesting comment about money in politics and your reference to the independent expenditure committees and 7-to-1 working for Republicans, and in the past, I guess, it's been the opposite. And a question I have, we had a lot of money spent here by labor unions in our Democratic primary. In the general election this fall, are the Democratic-leaning independent expenditure committees, labor unions, et cetera, sitting on their hands and not as active as they were in the primaries? What's going on there?
It's not so much, well, I think we have a couple things going on. One, It's not so much that they're sitting on their hands, nor are the traditional Republican interests sitting on their hands. They're still active. But what you do have is you have the unknown contributors now who are contributing to Karl Rove's new group, American Crossroads, which we don't know who they are. They're not, there's no legal requirement for them to be disclosed, certainly at this point. So we're unsure about that. And then you also have a very interesting story from the New York Times this morning, in which George Soros said he's sitting it out on the Democratic side. And he doesn't, his quote, which was just a great quote, was he doesn't want to get in the way of an avalanche. And so, he called himself a reluctantly involved in the campaign in 2004. Because he was not successful with John Kerry in 2004, he got involved in 2006 and 2008. But he's now pretending that that's not his thing, but nonetheless, he didn't want to get involved. You have an enthusiasm gap among donors. So, I mean, the traditional ones, the labor unions, are still spending money, but I think they're being outweighed by a lot of the unknown people, and also some people are just sitting on the sidelines. But we'll find more. I mean, that's going to be one of the great stories. I mean, I think it's the untold story right now of this election is this funding gap by outside groups. It's extraordinary. And it's really making all the difference. I mean, when you look at, again, a headline this morning in which Democrats are starting their triage strategy about pulling out of certain districts because they're just cutting their losses. There are certain districts that, you look at the internal polls of these campaigns, these Democratic campaigns, and they're running 7, 8, 9 points behind. Statistically, it just shows us that anybody running 30 days from the finish line, 7 points behind, 90% of them lose. I mean, it's just not worth the money anymore. So Democrats are reallocating their resources, but it's going to be pretty interesting. And the Republicans are not necessarily forced to do that if they've got this huge outside spending advantage. They're actually able to widen the playing field and really really get the Democrats. So it's a great story. It's an interesting story, and we're going to hear a lot about it over the next couple of years. And you can see the White House is a little obsessed with it. Right now, they're not exactly executing their message very well when they almost mistakenly blaming, foreign sources for backing these groups, which is not entirely true and not provable. But nonetheless, even just an hour or so ago, David Axelrod was continuing to make that point. So they're going to keep talking about it, and it's important. And so it'll be interesting to hear them talk about it, but we'll see how it all plays out.
Fernando.
Hi, my name is Fernando Coots. I'm a student here at the Clinton School, and on behalf of all of us, just really thank you for coming out and speaking to us today. My question was, you talked a lot about different predictions that different people had, different polls were showing, and I know the Dean and I have exchanged some predictions in the past. I was wondering if you personally had any predictions or expectations for how things will play out, and specifically, I was wondering how you thought the Tea Party would do both in this election and how that would fare out in the future and in future elections.
Right. Everyone, a lot of people ask my predictions all the time, and I just don't make them, mainly because I'm wrong more often than I'm right. In fact, the last time I was right was, the last time I was overwhelmingly right, actually, which is kind of ironic being here, but it was when Bill Clinton was not even running yet, and I suggested Bill Clinton could be president of the United States, and my Democratic friends, I was working in the Senate at the time, thought I was insane. So anyway, I was right on that one, but I've been wrong pretty much ever since. And your question on the Tea Party? I'm sorry.
Just how do you think it's going to evolve past
Well, I was actually at a dinner with President Clinton a month ago, and I asked him that question. And he actually, I thought he had a great answer, which was he believed that the Tea Party had the same roots as the Perot movement did in '92. And he believed that a lot of it was there. He said there's one big difference, and it's pretty interesting. It's an interesting thesis that I'd like to know more about. But he says the big difference there was that one man was funding it, and one man was tapping into that effort. He goes, here you have a situation where he believes there's no more than 3 or 5 people who are funding it. And he says there are corporate interests who are seeking to tear down government. And some of them have been profiled in the Koch brothers and the New Yorker recently. But that was it was his firm belief that there are 3 to 5 people who are funding the entire thing, which is pretty interesting because some of the candidates they're electing, that's exactly what they want to do. They want to reverse a lot of government growth. I mean, some of these statements, while perfectly rational and they make a lot of sense, it's pretty interesting hearing candidates say this because we haven't heard this for a long time. Absolutely taking down major portions of the government. So,
Questions?
As a follow-up to that, do you think that, they're Tea Party candidates, but they're running under the Republican banner. And do you think if we wake up the morning after the election and several of them or many of them have won, in the long term, is that productive or destructive to the Republican Party?
Well, as I think everyone at this school would know, that governing is far more difficult than campaigning, and it's easy to campaign, and I think that a lot of these folks are finding it quite easy to campaign, but boy, if Senator Jim DeMint from South Carolina, who has been endorsing a lot of these folks for U.S. Senate, and if he's all of a sudden has got an additional, let's say, 5 of the Tea Party candidates in the Republican caucus next year, can you imagine how hard it is for Mitch McConnell? Even if let's assume he's still minority leader, can you imagine trying to corral these folks? They really don't see eye to eye with the establishment Republicans on anything. So it'll be very interesting to see how it all works out. I think that some of these cases, I don't think it'll happen, but if someone like Carl Palladino were to win a governorship, that would be pretty interesting as well. In terms of just watching how it's done. But everyone finds out once they get in office that governing's a lot harder. Mario Cuomo was the one who said that campaigning is like poetry, governing is like prose, and so it's a paraphrase, but it's very true.
Questions? Right here.
Yes. I'm a student here as well, and thank you very much for coming. Very insightful evening. My question is, with these schisms that you're talking about in some of the party, in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, do you see a possible legitimation of some third-party discussions taking place? I'm not talking about like a cataclysmic shift to a parliamentary system or anything like that. Maybe just some inclusion into the debates, maybe the Greens or the Libertarian Party, some of these other factions that we're seeing split off. Does this lead to that?
I think it's a great question. It's one that people have been looking at for a long time because, as we know, our own two-party system has evolved, and parties have disappeared, and it would be interesting to see if that were to happen again. A lot of people thought after George Bush's presidency that he had so broken the Republican Party that it may never rise again. They've been very successful, though, at capturing this Tea Party fueled movement and internalizing it. They've been very successful doing that, and so maybe they've staved that off. I've always thought that I think it'd be fantastically interesting, but just to watch. But I think that a third-party movement would need to be run by someone who's kind of like Ross Perot, but not crazy, or more appealing to the mainstream. And the person that I always thought would be, in someone who can self-fund, because the funding in politics it's hard to get around. It's hard for someone to get around that. So, the person I always thought would be an interesting candidate, and he really ramped up in 2008, and then when Obama looked strong, he backed right off, but it was Michael Bloomberg in New York. He's a guy who could drop $1 billion and still have billions and billions left over. He's a guy who has not only been a businessman, which Americans, admire, but which we know doesn't necessarily mean you can govern, but he's governed one of the most ungovernable cities in America, and he's, by all accounts, he's done it reasonably successfully. So, someone like that would be interesting. He's also a guy who's been a Democrat and then a Republican and now an independent. And it's somebody who himself is disenchanted with the two parties. And he keeps saying he's not going to do it, but in 2008 he kept saying that as well. Meanwhile, he spent, I can't remember what the figure was, but it was millions of dollars ramping up and getting ready in case he did pull the trigger and do it. So.
Just to return to the Tea Party for a second, one of the things that I've been really curious about since they emerged is that they talk a lot about, oh, we want to take our government back, and there's so much overreach and everything like that. But I guess my question is, why now? During George Bush's 10 years president, there was a lot of government spending, ran up huge deficits. There was the government overreach of No Child Left Behind. What made now the time when the Tea Party just decided to explode?
Well, I think it was entirely the economic collapse in the end of 2008. I think that's when it actually impacted people. That's when people were thrown out of work. That's when things got really bad for a lot of people. And so I think that, well, everything, you're absolutely right. There was no fiscal responsibility through much of the Bush years, despite the rhetoric. But it didn't really hit home. Now, interestingly enough, most economists would probably say, this is absolutely the wrong time to have those types of feelings, because it's actually not going to help you. If there is no consumer in the economy, the government has to step in to be the consumer. At least that's what a lot of economists think. And now is not the time to worry about deficits. But nonetheless, those two thoughts are confused or put together, and it's become a pretty interesting movement. But I think it was entirely, that was an extraordinary event. Put yourself back there just 2 years ago. It was an extraordinary event. It made what was probably going to be a close presidential election into a blowout.
Joel, you got a question?
Yeah. You've run a website.
Hold on, Joel. Wait for the mic.
You've run a website for 11 years that's basically been the clearinghouse of the most significant political nuggets that have gone on. And I was wondering if, with the rise of mobile web, you have seen a change in either the flow of information or the kind of information that tends to make it onto the political wire now compared to a decade ago?
That's a really great question, and I absolutely have. Where I quoted before, and this is just kind of by feel. About 40% of what goes up on Political Wire is from readers, just everyday readers who are out there. More often than not, it's somebody who says, "Hey, I was just at this rally. I just saw so and so say something. You should be on the lookout for that." And I'll be on the lookout for that, or they may have direct quotes, or they may have some interesting stuff. But the advent of mobile technology allows people to be reporters. And so to me, that's a fantastically interesting thing. I go back to my discussion with that New York Times editor, and I would talk about corrections, and I said to her at the time, when I have a problem with what you wrote in the newspaper because you got something wrong, I can send you an email, except I can't find your email address. And then I can send you a letter, and it'll get to you 2 or 3 days later. And then 2 or 3 days after that, if you agree with me, you'll run a correction on page A19. And nobody will even remember it or see it at that point. I said, at least on my side, at least it's constant. And the same thing's happening with the types of news and the types of nuggets that are out there. It's this constant thing, and I don't think you can really. To me, the most. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but if you're a news junkie, you have to be on Twitter. It's unbelievable. I resisted for a few months because I didn't really kind of understand the 140 character limit and how important this could be. But it is remarkable how much information you get. And so some people will email me. Other people will send tweets to me. There are all sorts of ways that they'll get there. People will send videos to me. There was a reader who told me that Christine O'Donnell, I wasn't home watching Bill Maher, and that Christine O'Donnell said she was a witch, or she was involved in witchcraft. That was fantastic. I was ecstatic when I got home from dinner that night. I was like, what a great story that's going to be. But that's the beautiful thing is. So what I was trying to do when I first started it was, you go back to the late '90s, and you go back to a newspaper website, and they mirrored the paper versions of the websites. And you had a sports section, and you had a national section, you had an international section, and you had a business section, and you have a few others. But you didn't have a politics section. And I was like, how can you not have a politics section? To me, I was like, that's what I want. And to me, the feature that was fantastic was the front page column of the Friday Wall Street Journal called Washington Wire. And when I was 18 years old, I discovered it, and I couldn't wait for my Friday Wall Street Journal to come to read that column. And unfortunately, Washington Wire, even though it was the inspiration for what I do, it kind of fell apart. It's now a blog, actually, but it kind of fell apart, and it's not nearly as interesting as what it used to be, because they're still stuck on the most interesting things are what come out of their news bureau. you know. And for me, you know, I've got a relationship with Congressional Quarterly. They sell them advertising on my site, and so that's essentially what the relationship is. But I link to all their competitors, you know, whenever their competitors are breaking things, and that's what people expect. I mean, they want to see what is interesting, and they don't want this nonsense over who broke it or who didn't break it. And unfortunately, too many of the traditional media companies are stuck in that. You know, for me, I'm happy when none of them break it, when it's just a reader sending me something interesting. So,
Alex?
I was wondering if you could comment on your sense of the preparedness of President Obama to operate in a realm, as President Clinton had to do in '94, where you lose the legislative branch and be able to triangulate toward your benefit in order to achieve and accomplish things. And secondarily, I'd love to hear your thoughts, if you have any, on the rumor that has seemingly been discounted, but the rumored notion of Secretary of State Clinton and Vice President Biden being switched and for the purposes of the next campaign. Thank you.
It's also a great question. I think one thing I will make one prediction is that Dick Morris will not be back. You know, Obama will not turn to Dick Morris for triangulation this time. So, in terms, I mean, it's probably, just from a strategic point of view, it's probably the best thing in the world that Obama could have. The Republicans take control of the House. You know, Democrats keep the Senate, and they can use John Boehner as a foil for nearly everything. He's the perfect person to use. I mean, this is just perfect. I mean, he epitomizes how Democrats view Republicans, you know? I mean, that's, and I've said that intentionally because it's not the way Republicans all are, but it's how Democrats view Republicans, so he's the perfect person for that. And, you know, obviously, President Clinton was very successful at doing the same type of thing. So I think that they're probably okay with that. I actually don't think that they probably thought that might happen, which is why I think they had such an ambitious agenda for the first 2 years. Because they knew that the next 2 years they'd get almost nothing accomplished. So if you can't get things accomplished with 59 or 60 senators, there's no way you're going to get something accomplished with a Republican House and, you know, in fewer senators. So, and I've forgotten your second. Oh, no, I forgot. Oh, yeah. I mean, that was pretty interesting. You know, obviously it's been buzzing around for a while. The idea of swapping Biden and Hillary Clinton, and it got a new life when Bob Woodward on his book tour mentioned it in an interview on CNN, that this was on the table, was his direct quote, meaning that, you know, Bob Woodward speaks with some authority on this, and then Bob Woodward 24 hours later walks it back saying, oh, well, everything's on the table. But there's something true about that. Everything is on the table. And, you know, I've actually thought something a little bit more extreme than even that. If you think about, I mean, I'm not predicting this, but it's interesting to speculate about, is that, you know, President Obama had a very ambitious first 2 years, but he recognizes that his fate in 2012 is entirely dependent upon the economy, and that perhaps the economy does not recover. Because if you mirror Ronald Reagan's approval rates and the economic statistics on top of these last 2 years, they're mirror images right now, with one exception. This recession is worse. You know, this economic downturn is worse, and it's going on longer, and the job losses are lingering longer. And even though we're not technically in recession, according to the economists, the job growth is anemic at best, and it's going to take a decade or more to get back to the jobs that we had in 2006. So what I've actually thought is a real possibility, particularly when President Obama actually talks openly about this, is he suggests that maybe he'll only serve one term. And that one of the reasons why he brought Hillary Clinton into the cabinet as Secretary of State was that she'd make a perfect replacement for him on the Democratic ticket, which would be pretty interesting and not unheard of. Obama, I think, is a non-traditional enough politician that something like that could happen. I mean, I'm not predicting it will happen, but I think it's fairly interesting. I also think if they sit down together, I don't think Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton would mind at all swapping jobs if that's going to ensure that they get reelected.
Well, I'll tell you, if somebody's blogging tonight, that's a new one out there, that Obama's not running and Hillary can take his place. Get that one out there.
I'm not predicting that.
Get that one out there. That'll get us all over the news. Question, right here, Lance.
I was interested in your assessment of Arkansas in terms of our Senate race and in terms of how Arkansas fits in the whole Tea Party movement, just sort of what your impressions have been as to what's going on here in Arkansas.
You're the guy who tweeted that you were coming here. I saw that. There you go. I was actually, well, the only thing disappointing about coming to Arkansas right now is that the political races aren't that interesting right now, at least the Senate race and the gubernatorial race. It would have been interesting, obviously, in the primary if Senator Lincoln had been ousted by Bill Halter. I don't even know if that was ever a real possibility. The only poll that even suggested that was a possibility, it turned out was from a fraudulent pollster. And so unfortunately, that storyline disappeared, but that would have been certainly an interesting thing, and it would have played into the anti-incumbent fever here. I mean, I think that if there's a story out of Arkansas right now, it's that your governor is not facing any of the anti-incumbent tide, if the polls are right. That he remains very popular and will walk to re-election. So, I think that's an interesting story. Someone asked me earlier if I could think of any other cases in the country, and I blanked then, but I'll try to think of some, because that is an interesting thing. Who are actually, I guess there's one in North Dakota, John Hoeven, who's running for U.S. Senate. He's the current governor, and he's walking to re-election, although I don't think North Dakota, I'll take that back. Let me think about that a little bit more. But I think that's an interesting story, the politicians who, for whatever reason, did not face this anti-incumbent tide, because it seems to be hitting, both parties pretty hard. So.
Any other questions? Yes, sir, right here.
What's your best guesstimate where this Republican money is coming from?
Well, President Clinton thinks that a lot of the outside funding is coming from billionaires. Billionaires.
Which one?
Oh, I don't have a real best guess on that. It's probably not too hard to predict. People who've been politically involved, in the past. Very conceivably. Very, very conceivably. Although I think he's more concerned about his. Here's an interesting case. He's more concerned about his own energy policy that he's pushing, and he doesn't seem to be getting much help from either party at this point. They seem to have punted on the whole issue of a comprehensive energy policy. So the fact, whether his money will do any good at getting that through in the next 2 years, I doubt it highly. So anyway, I don't know, but it'll be interesting, and that'll be some of the great investigative journalism that comes out as people begin to figure out who these funders were. In this interesting year when all of a sudden they were allowed to be unknown.
Any questions? Taegan, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.